All right, everyone. It's about 5 after. We've got a couple more people that are still trying to join, but I think we're going to get ready for all the or get going for all the people that are on the call. No sense in wasting your time because I appreciate you being here. I know everyone's very busy, so let's just jump right into this, okay? Hopefully, everyone can hear me. I've done a little checking on that. Well, I think most of the people on the call know me, but just for those that don't, my name's Ashley Bright. I spent better than 17 years working in the digital advertising and marketing space. I spent at least the last 10 of those years working in the role of a creative director. And part of that role entailed, I mean, a big part of it entailed doing presentations, a ton of them, to clients, to internal teams, to external teams, to industry peers. And I learned what works and what doesn't. And I had the opportunity, thanks to Larry, who's on the call, to do some workshops around presentations and discovered a real need and an interest there. And so in 2010, I broke out on my own, started my own thing called Ashley Bright Presents, and where we focus exclusively on presentations. We work with clients to help them do audience research, organize their content, structure narrative and get story in there, work on the visuals, and then we also help them on the delivery. So we coach them on the delivery of the product. And in addition, we have a whole side of the business that is around exactly what we're doing right here: workshops, trainings, education. The goal is really just to empower everyone to do fabulous presentations. There's no need for bad presentations in this world. So that's kind of our quest. In 2012, we moved the business and the family to beautiful Tucson, which is where I am today, and it is a balmy 100 degrees, I believe, which is cooler than it's been for the last little while. And we love it here. It's great. My family is here, and we're very happy, and we feel very fortunate to be doing what we're doing. One thing about presentations that is always good is great quotes. And so these aren't necessarily related to our topic today, but it's always nice to have great quotes in there, and these always make me laugh. So there you go, a couple quotes from my kids. They have great questions to ask, and I'm always sort of taken aback by the inquisitive nature of kids. So, all right. So I'm going to assume everyone's still on the same page. If you can't hear me or see my screen or see the video, just let me know in the chat window there, and we will resolve it. So a couple little housekeeping items. So this is going to be about 40 minutes of content, and we're going to have 15 to 20 minutes at the end for questions. It's obviously we've got a short amount of time, 45 minutes, so we're not going to get too deep on some of these topics. We're going to do follow-up webinars where we're going to dig deeper into these topics, but this should give you a good taste and give you some good tangible things that you can take back and work into your presentations. So we'll do Q&A at the end. Along the way, please feel free as you're going through this to type out some questions in the question box, and we can definitely address those as we get to the end. I just want to make sure we can move through this, but I definitely want questions. This is as much for me to learn from you as you to learn from me. So feel free to send questions, and we'll get those all addressed. So thank you very much for being here. I am super excited. I can't really tell you how excited I am. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm excited to share this with you. So originally, the title of this was going to be, or it was, How to Create Presentations That Get Results. Now, it's a good title. I'll grant that. But in sort of working through this and looking at some of the questions I was getting from you guys preliminarily, I wanted to kind of step back a little bit. And so I've rejiggered some of the content, and I've retitled this, How to Communicate Your Ideas So They Inspire Action. What we're going to focus on are some key areas that I think are predominantly what's missing from most presentations today. And there are some tactics in there, but a lot of it is sort of these bigger thoughts around how to really engage your audience, how to create emotion, etc. And so we're going to focus on that. I think it's going to be really helpful and useful. But as I said, I love to hear your feedback. So communicate ideas so they inspire action. I mean, when it comes right down to it, I think we all know that ideas are sort of paramount. Ideas are the things that move society forward. They're the things that motivate whole countries and people to do amazing, inspiring things. And ideas can also work at a grassroots level. When you have people in the community, people that are fighting against things that they want, that they're passionate about, that spreading of ideas, that sharing of ideas, that communication, that dialogue is so critical to motivate people to change the world around them. And so, I mean, ideas just have this incredible power. And I think of late in the last decade or so, we've seen how very simple ideas, when executed really well and communicated effectively, can transform whole industries. I mean, think about how we use technology nowadays, how we use devices in our daily lives. They impact our business, they impact the way we communicate with our family and our friends, and the way we live our lives. And all of these, at their root, are simple ideas that are then shared and elaborated on and get people excited so they join the movement. They're inspired to take action and jump on board with this. And so that's what ideas are all about. And so ideas really, when we think about presentations, it's really all about the ideas. It's about sharing those ideas. It's about creating ideas in such a way that they're resonating with your audience and they're getting them excited about what you're seeing. And so a presentation is about sharing that idea. The problem is, as we all know, I mean, we all know this unfortunately all too well, is that the majority of the presentations we sit in are just downright terrible. They're boring, they aren't interesting, they're not engaging, they're often confusing, the thought is cluttered, you walk out unsure with exactly what you're supposed to take from it. And the problem with that is that it essentially kills ideas. You know, whether it's a small idea or a grand idea that's going to transform a business or an organization or a whole community, when that idea is not communicated effectively, it dies, and it's a terrible thing. Because what we ultimately want to do is connect with people and get our ideas adopted so people will take them from us and we will grow that idea and spread that idea. Now, the way we do that is we create connections. Connections are so critical. I mean, when we look at our one-on-one interactions with colleagues, with family, with friends, with strangers even, it's about that one-on-one connection. Well, when getting to a presentation, even though you're talking about a larger audience, you're talking about maybe a huge room or maybe a small room, but it's still about that connection. That connection remains the critical component to making that idea resonate and making that idea have a life of its own beyond sort of your immediate presentation. And so when we think about what are the things that make connections possible, we think about what are those elements that are the foundations of a great piece of communication, one-on-one or to a group. It's really about empathy, it's about emotion, and it's about engagement. Those are the three critical components to forming that connection, to resonating an idea, and sharing that effectively. And when we look at that from a more tactical place, when we think about specifically around presentations, when we're talking about empathy, it comes down to knowing your audience, understanding where they're coming from, understanding their point of view. And then the second point, when we talk about emotion, it's very much about how you use data and you give data meaning. Because, as we all know, we're sort of saturated with data. We've got numbers all over the place today. And a lot of it doesn't mean anything because we can't really put it in context. It doesn't have any real human significance because often the numbers are just overwhelming. And so the big challenge about data is how to give it emotion, how to make it resonate with your audience and with the people you want to share that with. And so that's the second piece. The third piece is how do you use storytelling? I mean, storytelling is one of those things that when you look back at our society, you look at sort of the whole history of human interaction, it's about storytelling. It's how we pass down information. It's how we communicate. It's how we share ideas. And so knowing your audience and being able to give the data meaning and using storytelling are kind of those foundations that build that connection, that allow that idea to have a resonance with your audience. And so those are the three sort of things we're going to talk about today. We're going to dig into sort of the why, the what, and the how of some of those. And there's a lot of good stuff there, and I'm excited to get you guys into this stuff. All right, so let's start with know your audience. Obviously, this is point number one, and it's when you say it, it seems so logical. Know your audience. It seems like such a logical thing, but it's amazing how rarely this is actually done. Very much when you're putting together presentations, it's often very much about you and what you want to talk about. which is understandable. But the problem is that your audience, they're the people that need to take your idea and run with it. And so you need to understand where they're coming from. It's a critical component of communication, is knowing where they're coming from. And I mentioned this just a second ago. I mean, when you're a presenter and you're putting your stuff together, there's often this sort of very you-centric approach, And so when you think about your audience, you think about you've been invited to a conference or a lecture or something of that nature, and you're very much there's a bit of an ego in there. There's a bit of pride. And so oftentimes our mind is in this place, it's sort of this presenter's myth, as I refer to it, where you think that what you're going to present is wonderful and great, and you're thinking your audience is going to think it's great too. That they're saying things like this about you, like, we love this topic, I'm so excited about this, oh my God, this presenter's great. I think they might be the next Steve Jobs. Okay, and this is very sort of you-centric. When in reality, your audience has got a lot of other things going on. They're distracted, they're busy worrying about what's going on right at that moment. They're messing around on Facebook, they're checking email, they're interacting with people around them. They may have bigger concerns. The talk that they're attending might be something that's going to change their business. It might be something that's going to change their industry. And so they're distracted. There's a lot more going on. And so the reality is that it's not about you. Okay, as much as you might like to think it is, it's not about you as the presenter. You are not the hero in this conversation. It's really the audience that are the hero. And so that's why it's so critical that you understand where they're coming from and you be able to speak to them and give them content in a way that is relevant and so that they understand it. I think this sort of quote here really sums it up well. Designing a presentation without your audience in mind is like writing a love letter and addressing it to whom it may concern. When you think about it in that way, it really sort of hits home. The reason, one of the reasons why so many presentations just don't resonate, they're not interesting. And I think it's because the presenter is not taking into consideration you as the audience and your needs and where you're coming from. Because ultimately what it's about is, as a presenter and an audience, you're in the same room, so we've limited a certain amount of the gap. But there's still a huge gap that exists between you and the audience. And so in understanding where they're coming from and doing your research, it allows you to essentially close that gap. It allows you to create common ground between you and your audience, and allows you, it's sort of fertile territory now to start to have that dialogue, to have that conversation, about whatever that topic is that you want to share. And when we talked earlier about that connection, about that relationship, that common ground and that understanding of where they're coming from is empathy. It's showing empathy for where they're coming from, and it's ultimately what is going to create that connection for your audience and for them to grab onto and be open to the ideas you're going to share. So how do we do this? The first thing you want to do is really get into their heads. It's a critical piece to understand sort of where they're coming from. And so by getting into their heads, you want to think about a couple key questions that you can ask. Couple key questions you can ask. First of all, why are they here? What do they need? And how can I help? For those of you on the call that have kids, it's very much like dealing with a child. How can I mitigate this situation? So how can I understand, why are you here? What do you need? And how can I help? And I think if you take that sort of approach to your audience, it can be very powerful. And so obviously you need to understand where they're coming from. So how do you do that? Well, now more than ever, at any other time in our history, we've got access to an unbelievable amount of data about our customers, about our clients, about the organizations we interact with. So use that data. Get online. If you're going to meet with a specific company, you can learn about their online presence through their social media, through their websites. Maybe their CEO has a blog. You can look at all sorts of things. There's forums. There's an unbelievable amount of data out there, and all you need to do is tap into it. You'd be amazed at what you can learn in half an hour, and how those little nuggets that you learn in this research will inform how you organize your presentation and how you communicate your information. Depending on the type of presentation it is, how important it is, the type of audience, you may want to get more specific industry research. And so obviously this is all available as well. I've just thrown a few up here, Forrester, Gartner, Nielsen. I mean, there's, again, a ton of research out there that you can use to inform how you approach your audience. Here, bear with me a sec. I'm just got a question here. I just want to see if I'm getting it. Okay, great. Okay, sorry. So, I mean, when we talk about how we do this, it's all out there. There's really no excuse for not being able to use it. One of the things I use, and I recommend this to everyone, it's such an easy task, is interact with people around you. So if you're in an organization, talk to your client partners, talk to the project managers, talk to the people that are interacting with your customers or your audience to understand where they're coming from. You can send out surveys, you can jump on the phone, you can do a ton of different activities that will give you really valuable insight to this audience. And what you're going to do with that information is essentially create a profile on each of your audience members. Excuse me. And you may have multiple profiles in your audience, and that's fine. The point is that you're starting to understand where they're coming from. I had a colleague I worked with years ago, and he was on the business development team, and he would actually put together dossiers on each person that was going to be attending the meeting. So you knew who they were, what their role was, but he would get to the granularity of like, what keeps them up at night? What are the reasons they might be resistant to this pitch that we're giving? And so, if you can get to that level, it's incredibly powerful, because then as we were developing the pitch deck and the talking points, we had that top of mind. We knew exactly what sort of questions we were going to get asked. And so if you go to that level, if you take it that deep, it can be incredibly powerful as a tool to aid the way you structure your content, prep you for the meeting itself, for the presentation itself. And that's incredibly valuable, obviously, in how you're going to interact with them and how you're going to communicate. And what that's going to do, we've sort of touched on it, but when you have this audience insight, what it allows you to do is align your goals for your presentation and align your content that's going to support those goals. Okay, and so once you have that alignment, you have that audience understanding, you have your goals clear for what you want the audience to take away from this presentation, then you can align your content to support those goals. And ultimately what you're doing is you're going to remove anything that does not support the message you want to communicate, does not support that goal. This is getting to that point of creating clarity, creating simplicity for your audience. If you can cut away all the distracting elements and focus on the things that are truly valuable, that are truly supporting the message that you want to share based on what you know about your audience, it will make your communication so much clearer, and it will resonate, and it will be adopted. I guarantee that you will see a significant benefit from approaching it in this way. And so if we're recapping briefly on this, it's very simple. Know your audience. I think fundamentally you need to know your audience. How you do that is doing some research. Get on the web, look at their sites, look at their blogs, look at their social media presence so you can understand where they're coming from. Look at industry publications, look at the news around that industry. You'll see trends. You can see what's going on. And then if you can, I definitely encourage the one-on-one interactions. Get on the phone, ask people some questions, take some people out to coffee. It's amazing how quickly you can get a really good sense for where they're coming from in just those very brief moments. And so those are the ways that you can get to know your audience. Now, we don't have time to get into a lot of then what do you do with that information. As I said, what you're going to do is align your goals, align your content with your audience understanding. But then you can get into a whole exercise around how you define your key takeaway, how you create your supporting points, how you structure your content. And so that's where we can have some follow-on blogs where we can webinars where we'll dig deep into those topics and we'll see how to use this information now to really form the basis of your content and the structure for your presentation. So the next topic we want to talk about is how to give data meaning. This is something that I don't think it's as obvious to people as knowing your audience is. I think people oftentimes get hung up on the fact that they have the data, and the data in their mind is valuable and resonates, and so they tend to just, they're enamored with that data. But the reality is that unless you can show how that data connects to the people it affects, it really doesn't have any meaning. And so you got to look for ways, and there's a variety of ways to do that, so that what you're sharing and the numbers you're throwing out there, it's often numbers, has some resonance with people and can really hit home. And so when we talk about, so what are the ways we do that? I mean, the first thing is look for ways to make that data compelling. I think, again, we get enamored with our data, and whether it's we're enamored with the data and then we're too lazy to articulate it in a way that makes it compelling, whatever that scenario is, it falls apart, and what it does is it makes your data fall short. So it's really not doing much good. And so when we talk about making compelling, I throw this example up there. I'm sure we've all seen variations of this where, you essentially see a spreadsheet or something equally overwhelming and confusing thrown up on a screen. And, as a presenter who's organizing this talk, I want to think about, okay, who is my audience? Because I've learned that. I understand who they are because I've done my audience research. And I know what's important to them. Maybe this is a quarterly review, revenue call, whatever that is. You know what's going to be valuable to this audience. And so the example that's on your screen, if what's really valuable to this audience is what are the total assets that we have and how has that changed year over year, then you can extract that data and put it on a slide and treat it more like this. What you're doing is you're cutting away all that clutter that's going to be confusing. You are focusing in on what's really valuable to your audience, and it's going to help their understanding, and it's going to help further what you're trying to share with them and the message that you're ultimately, or the idea that you are ultimately trying to communicate. And so in this case, we're showing assets, and you can see how clear that is. And if you want to take that to a next step, you can then build upon that, and you talk about, here is the actual percentage increase over last year. Okay, so by doing this, you make the data clear, you make it more compelling, and you make it resonate. And what you're doing is you are furthering the potential of your audience adopting your idea. And that's ultimately what the goal is here. So when it comes to making data meaningful, you want to make it compelling first and foremost. The next thing you want to do is figure out a way to make it relatable. I touched on this earlier. I mean, we are just buried under data, and most of it is just astronomical numbers that we can't even fathom. And so you need to figure out ways that, what are you going to do with this huge piece of data, this huge number, to make it really hit home for your audience, to make it relatable. And so this example here that I'm putting up, I think for anyone who's in the tech industry and understands kind of devices and that kind of thing, this is a pretty outdated stat. But at the time, this was Nokia. And this is probably 5 or 6 years ago. But Nokia at the time had 1.1 billion devices in use. Now, it's a big number, but it's hard to really wrap your head around that. And so in order to make it relatable, what Nokia did was put together these little vignettes where they essentially were saying, okay, what does that 1.1 billion actually mean? Well, this was a European audience, and they were saying, for example, that means at any given time, there's 300 of these devices being used on the London Eye, or there's 5,000 of these devices being used at Disney World. Okay, so suddenly what that does is it takes this really large number that's sort of unwieldy and kind of meaningless to a lot of people, and it brings it down to the earth so that they can see, oh, you see the penetration of this product. You see how it is used right around you in your everyday. And so it makes that data much more relatable for people that are consuming it. And really, again, it's about breaking down those barriers. It's about simplifying the communication so your audience understands it, and is clear so they can take action on it. Another really key piece, and this is sort of touching on the visual aspect of it, is how to make it more appealing. So keep in mind, you're trying to make it more compelling in how you select the data, how you structure it on the slide. And then you also want to look for ways to make it more appealing. And so, for example, this is a slide, it's from an old deck that I received from a client many years ago, and it was looking at essentially an advertising sort of calendar for the year. And, you know, it's fine on its own, but there's a limit, there's a barrier to understanding because you're having to sort of mentally try and track all these dates. And it's not really doing what it could in terms of supporting the clarity of this message. And so we shifted that around and treated it in this way. And so what we were doing is making it, you know, simplifying the information. We were making it visual. And by making it visual, we were able to take down one barrier so that someone wasn't having to, in their head, think about, okay, March, February, you know, do that calculation, that mental math that is now distracting them from what you want them to focus on. And so doing things like this will help clarify that and simplify the message. And then the last thing you want to think about, and this is, I think, where it really, that emotional component can really come to play here, is how do you make that data personal? Again, you've got these huge numbers, we see it all the time, and it doesn't really resonate, even when we're talking about things that are highly charged issues or highly impactful things that are going on around the world that are affecting people in dire situations. But when we hear the numbers, it's hard to really parse that. It's hard to understand it. And so you need to look for a way to take it from that 60,000 foot view and bring it down into someone's lap, to really hit them in the heart, to hit them where it counts. And so you want to look for ways to make that personal. And one of the ways you can do that, or many, but what you can do is you look at, you know who they are because you've done your audience research, of course. You want to look at how this information could affect their business or their industry. You know, talk about how it could affect their employees, could affect their bottom line, could affect them or their families, okay, or they themselves. These are all ways to take that data from a place it's a little bit gray, it's a little bit easy for them to dismiss it, and bring it down where it's sitting right in their lap. It becomes exceptionally hard for them to ignore it. And one great example of this, a number of years ago, Jamie Oliver, you may know him, he's called the Naked Chef. He's this very sort of well-known celebrity chef from Europe. And he's on a quest to improve the health, improve the diets of children primarily, but, you know, people in general. And he came to TED a number of years ago, and he essentially, his message was, you know, that America is the most unhealthy country in the world. Okay, not a new message necessarily, and when presented in that way, especially coming from someone who's not from the United States, it was easy to dismiss. It was easy for it to kind of go over your head. And so what he did in the very beginning stages of his talk is he essentially, I mean, it was in the first 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds of his talk, he asked everyone in the audience, he said, who here has children? And, you know, half the room put their hand up. And then he said, who here has nieces and nephews? Most of the rest of the room put their hands up. And so what he was able to do was immediately engage the audience, immediately get them thinking about their own family, their own children, their niece, their nephew. And then what he proceeded to do was then talk about the statistics and the information that around all these serious diseases and health issues that come from poor eating. And so he took something that could have been sort of, you know, over your head or glossed over and ignored, and he put it in a context and made it personal for the people in his audience, which suddenly made it resonate and made it powerful and gave that data meaning. And so the key is when you give data meaning, what you're essentially doing is giving your audience a reason to care. And that's the key. You know, because you care about the numbers, you care about the data, but your audience doesn't necessarily care. They aren't coming from where you are. They aren't trying to communicate the message you are. So you need to put them in a mindset where they care about the information that you're presenting. And so to recap on that, to give data meaning, first of all, you want to make it compelling. Based on what you know about your audience, based on what your goals are for this talk, you want to take that data and extract it from something that's complicated and confusing, and instead make it compelling, make it support your message. If you're talking about big numbers, if you're talking about things that are a little bit over their head, you want to bring it down to a level that makes it relatable to them. Draw comparisons to things that they understand that are in their daily lives. And then when it comes to representing that on screen, you want to look for ways to make that visually appealing. That will help in the adoption, that will help in the understanding. And then last but not least, and this is really, I think, where that emotion comes in, is there a way to make that personal, to make it really hit home for them, for their business, for their family, whatever that may be. And so if you can do that, what you'll do is give the data meaning, and it will help further your message, and it will help it resonate for your audience. All right, so the last section I want to talk about, and this is something that obviously it's a big topic, much like the others. There's a lot more to it than this, but given the time we have, I want to kind of introduce some thinking around this to you. Storytelling. It is something that is so critical and so rooted in our human experience, going back, forever. In terms of our human experience, yet it's something that when it comes to presentations, it's so poorly understood and it's so underutilized as a way to engage. Because human beings, essentially, we are creatures of narrative. It's how we interact, it's how we communicate. And so looking for ways to bring narrative into this presentation area is critical. I think obviously when we go to see a Hollywood blockbuster film, with special effects and science, they're out in space and et cetera, your heart is pumping. You're on the edge of your seat, okay? And that's a natural sort of human and physiological response. But that same response is also just as evident when you're talking about a very intimate, quiet scene in a film, between two people talking, because there is a story component to it. You are engaged, you're interested. And so there's sort of a fundamental curiosity or question about, well, what is it about presentations that makes this not the case? I mean, you've got people in a room, you're talking to them, they can see you. Why aren't we able to create that similar level of engagement, that similar intensity that people feel when they're watching a film or reading a book or interacting with a colleague or a friend? Well, it comes down to sort of an underlying structure. When it comes to stories, there is a structure to it. For great writers and great authors, this is something that comes naturally, but they understand how to use it. And so in this case, there's multiple types of structures, but in this case, it's a 3-act play or a 3-act story. And in the most basic sense, it's about a situation that unfolds in front of us. It's about somehow there's a complication, and then there's a resolution. And those are the 3 components that keep us there and keep us engaged, keep us on the edge of our seat or whatever it is to see what that resolution is. And so when it comes to presentations, there's no reason why a presentation cannot hold an audience's attention just the same way a great movie can. Okay, so how? I can hear you saying, so how? Well, there's something called the presentation form. Much like there's a structure to a story, there's something called the presentation form. And here it is. I'd love to take credit for it, but it's not mine. It's something that a woman named Nancy Duarte, who is a master at this. She's been doing this for 20 years. She did the research and she evaluated a whole plethora of very well-known presentations and speeches going back to the Gettysburg Address and things of that nature. And she was able to define this thing called a presentation form. And what it's essentially doing is this one here that we're looking at. This was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, one of the things she analyzed. And what she did is she looked at the language that was being used, and she was able to see this clear delineation. Across the top were all the positive things, all the uplifting things that he was saying about sort of the struggle and the challenges and the ultimate goals. And on the bottom were all the things that were sort of the status quo, that were the problems, that were the things that were keeping people down. And so she was seeing this pattern emerging between sort of where they want to be and where they are now, where they want to be, where they are now. And what she figured out from this was essentially that what this tactic was doing essentially was countering change. Because when we go into a room, when we go into a presentation, what we're doing is sharing a new idea with someone. And, that represents change. It may be positive change for their business, but it's still change. So even though we may be selling them a product or something that is going to change their industry in a positive way, for someone sitting in the room, they're thinking about, I'm going to have to hire, I'm going to have to fire, I'm going to have to reorg, I'm going to have to spend money. They're looking at all the reasons why they won't adopt this. And that's the problem, is your audience is sitting there with their point of view, and they are looking, maybe more subconsciously, looking for obstacles that they can put in the way of adopting your idea, because it's going to mean that they're going to have to change the way they do things potentially, or change the way they do things in their organization. And that's hard. So great metaphor. Essentially, for anyone who's a sailor out there, I'm not, but I understand the concept. Sailboat doesn't sail directly into the wind. It has to move back and forth. It tacks back and forth to make its way to a point further out in the distance, but it's going against the wind. And a presentation, when you're sharing an idea, when you're trying to do something new, it's essentially the same thing. You're trying to get your audience to an end point. But the challenge is that they're going to be resisting. They're like that wind blowing against you. And so they're going to be pushing back. And so you need to back and forth, just like the sailboat. That's what that middle part of the structure is that back and forth. And what you're doing is you're breaking down their resistance. You are slowly removing the obstacles that are going to be in the way of them adopting your idea. And what that back and forth is doing is creating something called contrast. And contrast is something that we're very familiar with. It's part of the human experience. We see it all the time. Our brains are naturally attuned to see contrast. And so we see it, day and night, male and female, up and down, love and hate. Okay, and so we naturally clue into that. And so when you start to utilize that structure, it creates something that in the presentation becomes much like the Hollywood film, where you're on the edge of your seat, you're waiting to see what the outcome is going to be. And so right here on screen, this is the structure for this presentation I'm giving right now. And you can see that when I drop the slides in here, you can see a better sense of sort of where this is coming from. So if you look at the top there on the left, ideas inspire, connections. We're talking about the positive aspects of how you share ideas and the benefit of doing it well. But at the bottom, you see that if you don't do that well, you kill ideas. You impede progress. And you can see as you go along this line, this pattern, you see positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative. And the goal is that you are breaking down resistance, and so that when you get to the end, when your audience leaves the room, they are much more apt to adopt your idea because you've broken down that resistance. You've answered their questions without them even asking them. And that's really the incredible and critical power of the presentation form. One example, again from TED, which is great, is this is a man named Brian Stevenson, and he is a justice activist, and he has a foundation where he's going into prisons and he's talking with inmates and he's helping people that are sort of the system is sort of put upon them, and he's helping them. Well, when he gave his TED talk, it's an 18-minute talk, he had very limited stats. He didn't use any visuals at all. He didn't use any slides. What he did use was this presentation form where he was juxtaposing these elements to break down barriers, to get the audience to have a better understanding of where he was coming from and why this was such a critical part of his life and a passion. And that number that I've got on screen, that 15 million, what that represents is the donations that he got from that 18-minute talk. Without any slides, without any visuals of any kind, no supporting materials, just being able to tell his story and use that presentation form to go back and forth and get people understanding where he's coming from. And so, incredible success, obviously. And the point is that this is something that you can use, whether it's a big way or a limited way, to really help break down those barriers and help your audience see your point of view so they're more likely to adopt the ideas you're sharing. And so when you're starting to think about your next presentation, start thinking about the points that you're sharing. And are you creating contrast, between the good and the bad, and not necessarily the good and the bad, but where they are now, the status quo, and where they need to be, the new utopia, sort of, and you're creating that back and forth so that you break down those barriers. And so ultimately, I mean, all of this, all three of these key points are all at the service of ideas, because that's really what presentations are all about. It's about sharing ideas. It's about having those ideas resonate so that you can further that idea. You can create adoption. You can create a movement. You can transform. Because remember, if you do not do that effectively, if you do not share that idea, whether it's small or big, what happens is that idea dies, okay? And that could mean you die, your business dies, your career dies, not to put too fine a point on it, but that's what it can mean if you do not communicate this effectively and your idea dies. And so rather than have it die, utilize these principles, give this level of thought and consideration to your presentations. And what you'll do is you'll love ideas. Your ideas will be adopted. Your ideas will be going out there in the world and changing things. And so it's about that use of empathy. It's about using emotion. It's about creating engagement through these techniques, by knowing your audience, by giving the data that you are sharing, the data that you are sharing with them meaning, and use storytelling. Use this presentation form to help them understand and break down those barriers to adoption. And what you're going to do with that is you're essentially going to be creating a valuable connection that will make your audience adopt your idea, make your audience have that connection, so that your idea is adopted. Your idea has got wings and it will fly. And that's ultimately what I want to do. That's what I'm here to do today. And, I hope that this has sort of given you some insights into what some of these presentations that you see from Seth Godin and from Simon Sinek and from all the people at TED and that kind of thing, this is what they're doing. This is how they're doing it. This is how they're creating that connection and getting that powerful engagement, that emotional reaction to what they're doing is through using these techniques. And so I want to sort of end here. I think we've got a fair bit of time for questions, 15 or 20 minutes for questions, which is great. One thing I'd like to ask is that I'm going to leave this on the screen. I'd love to hear your feedback. As I said, this is as much about me learning from you as you learning from me. And so send me an email. I'd love to hear what you thought. I'd love to hear if this is valuable, if there are parts of this that were more useful than others, and what else you'd like to learn. Because as I said, we're going to do follow-up webinars where we can dig deep on some of these topics. I've just kind of skimmed the surface on a few of these. But we can dig deep on some of these topics and really get into more the heavy tactics and how they can inform your structure and your visuals and all these other things. But these core elements are the things that I think really need to be sort of imbued into more presentations. All right, so that's kind of where we're at. I'm going to, if you want to type in your questions, I've got a few here. But if you want to type in your questions, I will try and address them as best I can. And if you have any additional questions, you can definitely send them to me afterwards or send them in an email. I'm happy to follow up. So I'm just going to kind of look at some of these questions that are here. So one of the questions I think, so Larry asked this back when we were talking about how to do research, audience insights. I think it's interesting when you look at social media, especially if you're looking at members within an organization. So rather than the social media feed for the company itself, but rather looking at the people that work at that organization, it's amazing how you can see these sort of things come to light, these patterns come to light. I've used these to influence, you'll hear about something like an impending, I heard one where they were talking about an impending move that was coming up. They were reorganizing the group. And that was something I learned because it was sort of set on a social media feed. And so I was able to then use that in follow-up conversations that I had. and it became very valuable in understanding kind of the urgency that was going on around this piece of communication. And so that's one example. Sorry, I'm reading here. Sorry, I'm reading Larry's comment here. I found that my audiences are seldom monolithic. You get a wide range of participants with different needs and interests. Which end of the spectrum would you shoot for in designing for your presentation? That's a great question, and I think it's obviously very true. Your audience, there's going to be a wide range of people in there, different titles, different roles, different backgrounds, and so it becomes a challenge. I mean, I think oftentimes you can look at what is the situation itself. So let's say I've seen this. I've been to a variety of entrepreneur conferences. And so right there at the top, entrepreneur conference. So, it's a given that there's going to be entrepreneurs in the audience, right? It's not sort of a stretch. Now, those entrepreneurs are going to be in all different stages of their companies and their businesses and what they're doing. But entrepreneurs is the key. And so if you even take that type of an insight and you have an understanding of what are the things that are on an entrepreneur's mind, you can tailor your presentation. And I saw exactly this about 2 years ago. I went to an entrepreneurs conference and I was in the audience and I listened to the speakers. And at least half the speakers were talking about things that had no value to the people that were there. But there were one or two who, they spoke directly to the individuals, specifically because they were using language and talking about challenges of entrepreneurs. And so I think that, yes, it's a challenge when you have a big audience, but I think you can look at what is the bigger picture, what are the sort of the threads that go between them, and tailor your message to that. Obviously, if you're going into a small venue, a small sales meeting, let's say, you can be very specific and you can tailor that very specifically to your audience. So Larry, I hope that sort of answers the question, but I agree, it's a challenge, but I think what you need to do is look for that common thread that moves throughout the participants and aim for that and look for that alignment between what you're doing and what you want to say and where they're coming from. Training rate, emotional response. Hold on, let's see. Insight. Okay. Oh, so hey, Glenn, I'm just seeing your point here. Empathy and generating an emotional response. Were you saying that as a positive? That's something you're taking away from that that's interesting, or did you want me to talk a little bit more about that? Okay, great. I'm just reading another one of these questions. Okay, so Glenn's asking, empathy and getting into their heads. What are the considerations for an audience that is diverse? You may only have shared interest in your topic. Okay, so this is very in line with what I was just talking about with for Larry's question. So yeah, there's no silver bullet here, and obviously there's going to be a range of opinions, but you're going to do a much better job by sort of putting a stake in the ground and getting, at least a certain amount of alignment with your audience. So that they feel as though you're at least speaking to them from something that is informed and you're showing that empathy. All right, any other questions? We've got, let's see, we've got about 5 minutes left. Let's see. I'm reading another one from Larry. So because you're trying to maintain a structured story arc, do you prefer the audience to hold their questions to the end, as you did here today? It depends. It depends. I think it comes down to sort of the venue and the time frame. It varies. If I've got a larger group, if I've got more than 8 or 10 people, I like to keep it fairly structured, and so I will upfront tell people that, hey, we're going to move through this information, we're going to time bucket it. And then we will have time at the end for questions. And so that allows you to stay on track. And then at the end, you obviously have time for questions. I do this a lot when it comes to client presentations. So when I'm presenting something to a client, I like to kind of, sort of put some structure around it, because otherwise what happens is you get off course and it derails the impact and the power of your message. So I think especially if you're doing a sales pitch of some sort, I think it's valuable to try and frame it so you have time to get through that. On the other hand, if I've got a smaller group, it's more intimate, or it is a more collaborative environment, I'm a big one for just letting it be open. Because oftentimes that's where a lot of value can come, because I may have I've done my best to create content that is aligned with my audience. But when I have that very collaborative, open discussion, it's amazing how much of more detail can come out and how much more specific it can get for that audience. So it's half a dozen, one or the other. I mean, you can sort of go either way, but I think there's value in both. All right, so I'm looking, last question here, or not last question, but let's see where we're at. So what techniques do you recommend to get into the right state before and during a presentation, relaxed, focused, etc.? Very good question, and something obviously I didn't touch on. But yeah, I mean, going out on stage, there's a certain amount of just physiological response. It's very natural, and so a couple things I'd suggest. The first thing is when you're rehearsing, there's 3 things to do when you're rehearsing. 1, rehearse with your slides closed. Close your laptop. Just rehearse from memory. What it does is it helps get that structure of your talk very clear in your head. The second thing when you're rehearsing is do your presentation out loud. Don't do it quietly. Don't do it sort of in the shower. Do it out loud, because what it does is it gets you used to your own voice. And sometimes that is something that wigs people out. They're not used to hearing their own voice. And then the second thing to do, and this is really critical for sort of dealing with nervous energy, is move around. While you're rehearsing, get used to moving around. Now, I don't mean kind of like pacing back and forth in sort of an odd way, but I mean move around, be casual. Because then when you get on stage, what's going to happen is you move around the stage, and what it does is it dispenses a lot of that nervous energy, which is a critical thing. But it also has a second benefit, which is it creates engagement with your audience, because when you move around, it forces them to kind of track you and watch you. And so it creates sort of a secondary way of getting people engaged. And so, Glenn, those are a couple techniques, the way you rehearse. So say your presentation out loud, close your slides, and move around. And that gets you comfortable for moving on stage, because that working with your laptop closed will build confidence. You'll know your topic. Moving around will dissipate that nervous energy, and it will create engagement for your audience. So those are a couple things. I mean, everybody has their own little ritual, but those are some really good techniques that I use and that our clients use to help them feel more relaxed and focused when they get on stage. Okay, I've got another question here. How would you approach change in presenting a webinar versus a live in person? That's a great question. I mean, obviously, it becomes challenging because when you're in person, I mean, that in person is significant because you can see how people are reacting. You can see if the mood of the room is starting to sort of creep down or creep up. And so you can react to that. And so that's obviously a critical thing that's missing in a webinar. And so in a webinar, I mean, one of the things I did, that's why I included video. That's why I had the video forefront, because you can see me, and obviously I can't see you, so it's a bit of it's something that I'm missing. But it allows, I think, again, for that human connection. Another thing to use in webinars it's a way to use it when you are doing an in-person presentation. It's a good way to ask questions of the audience, ask for their insights, ask for their opinions, because it keeps them engaged, it keeps them on their toes, and it changes the dynamics of the presentation because it's not just you talking. In a webinar, that obviously becomes more challenging because you don't have that same level of interaction. And so in webinars, what you can use is something called polls. I'm not using them right now, but you can have these polls that go out, you can time them, so they go out to your audience as you're speaking, as you're going through your presentation. And so it allows for a similar level of engagement. Obviously, it's through typing versus speaking out loud, but it's a way to create that engagement, to have the audience feel that you are interested in what they're saying and their opinion, and create another level of engagement. So those are some techniques that you can use for a webinar versus a live in person. And then Larry just posted here, actually, Glenn, this is a good one for you. You're asking about kind of how to deal with sort of, nervousness or stage fright or feel more focused on stage. If you go to TED Talks, there's a great talk by a woman named Amy Cuddy, and she talks all about body language and how to use body language and posture and voice to build your confidence, to go out on stage and sort of be. It's the epitome of fake it till you make it. But she has techniques that will allow you to go out there and feel confident. So her name is Amy Cuddy, Cuddy, and she's great. It's a great talk. I've seen it, and so I recommend you go check that out. So we're kind of over our time here. I appreciate everyone that stayed on the line. Is there any other last questions before we kind of jump off? We're right at 1 o'clock here, and I want to make sure everyone gets back to their busy schedules that they've got for the day. All right, if there aren't, let me just say in closing, I mean, I really, really appreciate you guys taking the time. I know everyone on the line I know fairly well, and so I appreciate you taking the time. And I really would love it if you could give me some feedback. You know, send me an email, answer these 3 questions, and you know, I've got a thick skin. I've been doing this a long time, so let me know what's working, what isn't, things that we can do better, and also really let me know what are the things that you want to learn. Because we're going to be doing follow-up webinars. We're going to be sort of broadening the way we do this. And I want to make sure I'm giving people what they need and really empowering them for success. So keep that in mind. And thank you all very much for your time. And one last thing, I will, if you'd like, this is recorded, so I'll post this and I'll let you guys know where it is if you want to revisit it for any of the things that we've talked about today. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And we'll see you soon. Have fun presenting, okay? Get out there and share some ideas, change some lives, and empower yourselves and empower the audiences. All right, thanks, guys.